Let's see. This is definitely started now, and I'm gonna go. All right, hi everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. This is the sort of every single month Muslim Girl brings you the girls' room. And so for this month, we're going to have the girls' room. It's going to be focused on Sexual Assault Awareness Month. We wanted to focus on Sexual Assault Awareness Month and an entire sort of panel for the girls' room because of two things. One was the entire incident that happened in Chicago, and we have Nadia from Girl Heart from Chicago, who's been working with that case and survivors here, who's going to walk us through a little bit about that case. And also because April is Sexual Assault Awareness Month, just to give you a little bit of history around Sexual Assault Awareness Month since the 70s. This has been a speak out event that all over the country women have been using, and men, to talk about sexual assault and the importance of addressing sexual assault. And so every single year, whenever I'm involved in any events around Sexual Assault Awareness Month, I'm always like, I want to have a space where we can talk about sexual violence within our local Muslim communities. What are the unique type of barriers? What are some similarities across the board that many survivors face? The other thing is that recently, because there's been more and more interest in this issue in the Muslim community, not to say that there's a broad-wide interest, but that there has been certain events that have happened, certain individuals that are coming in to talk about it, and too often the discussion around sexual violence tends to perpetuate the very problem in terms of the rape culture, and sometimes people are talking about survivors, but there's no real necessarily talking to survivors, even though, I mean, I identify as a survivor, and it's like, we don't need your saving, we just need you to understand that we have to address the culture, the rape culture in our communities. The other thing is that we also have to remember that it is a lot of times survivors who are organizing around this to bring more attention. So just wanted to, bring that, and we have a star-studded panelist, many women whom I admire for the work that they're doing. We have Nadia, we have Navila, and then we have Samaya. So I'm going to hand it over to Nadia to give a brief introduction about herself. Okay, let me.
Assalamu alaikum. So my name is Nadia Muhajir, and I'm co-founder and executive director of Heart Women and Girls. First, I just wanted to thank Muslim Girl and the Raksha for inviting me to speak today among such really awesome colleagues of mine and people that I'm really honored to call colleagues. Today I'm going to be sharing a little bit about Heart's work and some of our most recent involvement in a sexual abuse case here in Chicago. So Heart Women and Girls was founded to fill a void in the community. As I was working on reproductive and sexual health issues in the community, people began sharing with me their stories. Soon I learned of girls struggling to identify common medical problems. I learned about girls and women struggling with intimacy issues. And all too often, I heard of stories about sexual violence. And so despite the fact that a lot of these problems exist across cultures and socioeconomic status and education, there was one thing that was common with all of these stories. And that is that these women and girls, particularly those in faith-based communities, did not feel that they had a safe space to learn about and seek information on their sexual health experiences without being blamed and shamed. So this was the void that Heart was seeking to fill. And so one of the ways that we do that is through having culturally sensitive approach to our programming. And so one of the ways that we do that is to provide a safe space, both virtual and in person, to women and girls who come together to learn about their bodies, share their experiences and challenges, and ultimately become a resource for each other in their communities. So that being said, our approach is simple. We present sexual health information and resources in a way that's accurate, that's comprehensive, that's free of blame and shame, so that those who are struggling with a sexual health issue can feel comfortable. And so, as I mentioned earlier, all too often, we've actually heard many, many stories of sexual violence and the silence that survivors suffer in, and the lack of cultural sensitive resources that are out there for them. So I just wanted to just give a little bit of a background on our most recent work on the case here in Chicago, and then hand it over to the other two panelists. So our most recent work was actually a sexual abuse case against a prominent imam in Chicago. So late last year, a young woman came forward with allegations of sexual violence against a prominent imam in the community. And soon we actually learned that she was not the only victim, and that there were many more survivors, and the abuse actually spanned decades. So just in February, 5 of those survivors were able to file a civil lawsuit, and the imam was also criminally charged. The role that we played was a central role in supporting the survivors by connecting them to the social and legal resources that they needed, as well as to raise awareness about sexual violence in the community, being cognizant of the fact that community pressure and cultural beliefs were one of the biggest barriers that these survivors were facing with respect to coming forward. So as a conversation continues, I would love to share some of my lessons learned from this experience.
Great. Thank you so much for mentioning that. So with that, I'm going to move on to actually Navila now. So.
Hey everyone, so my name is Navila, and I'm actually one of the co-founders of the Cathartist. I founded it with my girlfriend Julie, who's in North Carolina and could not join me, but no worries. So in terms of why we started the Cathartist and how it kind of came about, is this shared interest of our advocacy for sexual assault and how it's something that's been pretty much a part of our lives. So for me personally, I grew up in a household where, unfortunately, I was molested by my cousin, and that happened for like close to 7 years, and then just last year I was raped. So sexual assault or sexual violence as a whole is something that's pretty much in my life and has been in and out. And Julie and I wanted to do something about 3 years ago where instead of kind of taking the time to argue and kind of be angry at each other through emails at society, we wanted to kind of build a space where survivors like ourselves could help and start this coping and healing process, which not a lot of us, well, in terms of the sexual violence community, we don't really focus too much on that aspect because it's not something that's talked about, is the trauma that's, kind of happens along with sexual violence. So we created this online web platform called the Cathartist, and the Cathartist is basically catharsis and artists put together, and it's the space where we wanted individuals like ourselves who not necessarily were invested in having conversations online, but rather wanted to utilize our own skills and strengths in things like photography, artwork, creative writing, dance, what have you, and using those particular strengths as a way to kind of empower ourselves to know that we are individuals that are not defined by the violence, the sexual violence itself, but rather as a way to move forward and heal. So this idea of having this journey and kind of undertaking it together as a community. So we created this platform, and then eventually it turned into a space where people who weren't necessarily affected by sexual violence, but rather were very much a vocal, advocate. We also created a space where, there's an op-ed piece where people can be advocates, and then later on we created another sister site where it's called Words Over Violence, where people who wanted to actively engage could have that opportunity. So that's the basis and I guess the foundation of the Cathartist is this idea of our own personal experiences stemming from anger and wanting to do something, and then creating an online space, which we hope to, inshallah, eventually create into a more materialistic, in-person space. So, as time goes on, as we all build our strengths and, become a lot more professional in what we do, inshallah, it'll be something that's more doable. But that's the basis of what I do, the work that I do, along with just me being a social worker student and working with intimate partner violence victims, as well as sexual assault violence victims, and doing a lot of psychotherapy with them and a lot of case management. So that's just a little bit about myself and what I do.
Mm-hmm. Great. I just wanted, before I hand it over to Samaya, I just wanted to say that if you want to ask questions, if you could use the hashtag MGSAAM, SAAM, and on Twitter, so I'm going to be monitoring the Twitter feed just to see if there are any questions coming up. So just wanted to put that out there. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Samaya.
Hello, Assalamu alaikum, everyone. And thank you, Darakshan and Muslim Girl Net, for inviting me to be on this panel. I'm very excited to talk to all of you today. So I work at USC, the Center for Religion and Civic Culture, and I do work with American Muslim civic leaders. And about 4 years ago, I think it was 4 years ago, Nadia, I started speaking out about my story. I was sexually assaulted at the age of 12 by the 18-year-old son of close family friends, and I was quickly blamed for it. And there was also a lot of silence around what had happened, and it was a very difficult thing to experience for a very long time, for decades. And it carried on until my mid-20s, right when I was 25, I decided that I was going to go to a local imam who was very well known and prominent here in Southern California, and talk to him about my sexual assault and the struggles that I was experiencing because of it in my life. And after sharing that, he sexually harassed me multiple times. And it was an awful experience. I felt like things were crumbling all over again at that point. And I knew that there were going to be many others. And I had found out about 5 years later that there were indeed many others, and the reports ranged from harassment to assault. And once this surfaced, he was dismissed from the mosque where he was working, and he fled the country. At that point, myself and about 2 or 3 other women got together, and we decided we wanted to do something about it. Because there was nobody addressing this, there was nobody speaking out about this, there was a lot of silence in the community around this, and a lot of survivor blaming and shaming. And so we decided that we would work together to create an online platform where we could call the Rahma Network. It's still in progress, so please have patience.
Mm-hmm.
But the goal is to create this network of people working on sexual violence, sexual abuse across the states, so that every community has support, has someone who is knowledgeable about this that can inform them about how to respond, how to support survivors in their institutions. And also provide support to survivors by connecting all these individuals and the communities they live in. So that's the goal. And what I've been doing in the meantime is I've been speaking out and sharing my story, and I've partnered up with someone who is now a dear friend of mine from the Catholic Church. She's the Victims Assistance Coordinator for the Catholic Church, the LA Archdiocese. And she supports the victims who have come up because of clergy abuse or of other kinds of abuses that are happening within the Catholic Church, whether it be at school, between administrators, whatnot. So it's been great learning from her what the Catholic Church as an institution has been doing to combat this issue. And unfortunately, you know, this had to happen within their church, but fortunately we have such a great example of what can be done, and they've implemented a lot of great policies and measures to protect their constituents, and they regularly speak about this in their church, and they've been able to drastically reduce the number of cases within the church and provide adequate support for the members who are survivors. So we do workshops together within the community out here in LA, and we do it for a number of different groups. We do it for social work students. We do it also predominantly for clergy and lay leaders from different faiths and teaching them the importance of faith leaders responding to this properly, and providing proper support and implementing the right kinds of policies within their institutions to create safer spaces.
Mm-hmm.
And that's me in a nutshell.
Oh my God. As always, I'm always so inspired by all of you, and thank you so much for sharing your stories. It's really always, for me as a survivor, to hear other Muslim women is always so empowering, because there's so much silence around this, and we're silenced so heavily because of shame and culture and all of that. It's always powerful to hear all of you. So with that, I want to move into a little bit, and this is something that is actually very difficult for me, because how do we define sexual violence? And sometimes, you know, there's the kind of definitions we do have, but then, like, what are some of the gaps around those definitions? Are they fully encompassing, or do they end up leaving out survivors? So I want to start with that in terms of with Nadia, and then we can kind of move forward with that. All right.
So one of the things that we have been thinking about and learning from the community conversation since this case went public was that we learned that most people actually don't understand sexual violence. And I know Nabila is going to go into some more detailed definitions, but one brief point I just wanted to make was that many people end up thinking that it's just limited to rape, and not necessarily a whole range of abuses that we're talking about. So most of the conversation around sexual violence in the community is generally, you know, people are just preoccupied with whether or not there was an actual physical rape that occurred, and if it didn't, anything else was kind of minimized or ignored. So, you know, you would hear things like, it's not like he raped you, or, oh, come on, that's just how elders behave. So it's that kind of language that kind of, you know, it's a cross between, definitely a cross between, you know, victim blaming, but also acknowledging the fact that a lot of people don't even understand the difference between rape versus assault versus abuse versus harassment, and that, you know, there's a range of crimes, and you know, they can be from, you know, virtual, you know, sending an inappropriate picture to someone via text or email, to, you know, actual assault, attempted rape, or rape. So and we can't minimize any of those crimes, because they're very traumatizing to the survivor. And I think that's something that's problematic in our community, that people do not have a comprehensive understanding of what sexual violence includes. And I think at this point, Nabila may have some more to add to that.
Yeah, sure. Great. I'm going to pass this to Nabila.
So Nadia hit the nail on the head with everything she said. A big thing that I've noticed within the Muslim community is just that, right? Is understanding, or rather the lack of understanding, of what is sexual violence. And again, it's not limited to rape. And just another added feature to this entire conversation is that growing up, and in terms of what we learn and what we absorb, survivors and victims themselves also are not aware of what is sexual violence to them. So when I was younger, to me, whatever was going on to me, I never identified as this is sexual violence, and that this is something that is very problematic, and I should speak up and out about this, and, you know, move forward from there. So again, the idea, and I guess the conversation of how do we define it, can be very nuanced, just because, again, unfortunately, due to like state-by-state laws, and also internationally, like, how are we actually defining it? What does sexual violence look like? What is the umbrella? It seems like sexual violence is the umbrella term, but what falls within that, right? So there are things, for example, consent and non-consent, physical versus non-physical touch. Where is the person touching you? Who is doing the touching, and what are the intentions? And when it comes to the Muslim community, just because there was no, for example, and I don't mean to be graphic, but just because there was no penetration does not necessarily mean that there was no sexual assault or sexual violence occurring to the individual who is the receiver of that abuse. And that's something that's really important to hone in, especially with the whole controversy with the Chicago Imam, is minimizing certain acts because we don't see the larger molded picture of, well, in Law and Order, this is what they said sexual assault or sexual violence is. Or in the movies, this is what I've seen. Or it wasn't rape because that's what my community said. At least you weren't raped. And that is oftentimes what happens with survivors or victims, is that this is when they won't come out and this is when they become silenced, is because of this lack of understanding of how do we define what sexual violence is. And it's a large array, right? Because it could be completed or attempted penetration for the victim. It could, alcohol could be an issue that, you know, facilitates whether or not that happens, or even non-alcohol. But a lot of times that's something that happens, and again, we cannot minimize the person just because of that. Also, just attempted force of touch, unwanted verbal sexual harassment, like these are all things that happen, and they all fit within the realm. Groping, making comments, especially when you're a prominent leader within the community, whether it's religious or just, you know, even just in passing. I've had several conversations within the past year where several prominent spoken word or charismatic Muslim brothers, you know, just cannot be seen in the light of being an abuser or an abusive party because they're just so charismatic. They take a leadership role, but unfortunately, the truth is they are just as likely capable of being abusive, especially when it comes to giving unwanted sexual advances to someone who wishes to not accept it. And that's something that we really need to discuss, is that no one is, what would you say, no one is shied away from being an abusive party, right? Because sexual violence is so nuanced and so broad that a lot of things can fall within that. And I think it's really important that as a Muslim community, we start to engage with talking about sex and sexuality because of this idea of boundaries. And I don't think boundaries is something that's set, and that's why sexual violence is just so blurred when it comes to, for example, you know, the prominent leaders within our community, or even just the Muslim community itself, in terms of, well, you know what, it wasn't rape, so you're fine. But that's not okay, and that's very problematic. And so understanding that there are different types of sexual violence, whether it's physical or not physical, also along with the fact that we are in an age of technology. Cyberbullying is a huge thing, and this idea of phones and pornography, again, this all falls within the context of sexual violence, and it's extremely traumatizing for those that are on the receiving end. And the ramifications of any type of unwanted attention that could, you know, constitute being sexual, you'll see those ramifications psychologically and emotionally, and it can become something that's very debilitating for the being victims or survivors. And then when we add the stigma in terms of being Muslim within the Muslim community, that is also something that, you know, starts to hinder the person and also silences them. So again, those are just some things to be aware about in terms of how are we defining sexual violence? What does that even look like in terms of us as Muslims, and why are we shying away from really talking about very specific things in terms of sex and sexuality, which could essentially help victims and survivors come out of this shell and start to express things that really should not be allowed, and should victims themselves should not be dismissed for.
No, thank you. Thank you for sharing that. All right. What do you think, Samaya, in terms of definitions?
I think the definitions that Nadia and Nabila both presented were great and very thorough. I'm not sure if there's any much more that I can add to that. These were great.
Great. I think what I'll just add is that something that Nabila said that really stuck with me is in terms of the definition and the language as well. I know that as a survivor for many years, I did not claim that it was sexual assault. So even for survivors, the language is not always accessible, and we should also allow for survivors to define what it is themselves. And I think sometimes it can be, the term is so heavy when you say it, and so just thinking about also accessibility for individuals who are impacted by it. The next thing I want to transition into is in terms of barriers. So, you know, some of the questions we're getting is things like, all right, what can the community provide in terms of safety or in terms of accountability? But I also want to talk about barriers to coming forward. And I know all of you hit certain pieces, but I'd love if we could have a deeper conversation around specifically barriers. We'll go to Nadia for that.
So, you know, one of the things that I want to talk about is that we know that the barriers to reporting sexual violence are actually cross-cultural. It's inherently difficult, no matter what race you are, ethnicity, socioeconomic background. It's inherently difficult to be a survivor, you know, because the experience is such a great violation of your emotional, social, physical safety. You know, it's just inherently difficult. So I want to emphasize that this is not just an issue that's unique to the Muslim community. But that being said, there are some unique challenges that I've learned about in the last couple of years when I've been working with survivors that make it just a little bit more difficult for them to come forward. One thing that I want to mention is that the statistics actually report that sexual violence and sexual assault is one of the most underreported crimes in the United States. So nearly 70% of crimes, a sexual assault, goes unreported. I would actually say that just anecdotally through the fieldwork that I've done through HEART, that number is actually higher, or that percentage is actually higher in the Muslim community, and I know that research does support that communities of color have a tendency to report less. So I think that's interesting to think about. I think another thing that makes it interesting to think about is when I talk about reporting and coming forward, I'm not just talking about reporting to police. I'm actually even talking about coming forward to your family or to the perpetrator himself or herself, or the institution that committed the crime. So when I'm talking about coming forward, and the survivors that I've worked with, you know, oftentimes we didn't even get to the police because they weren't even ready to come forward to their families. And so that's something to consider as well. And what does that mean for the survivor, you know, seeking justice? But real quick, some of the key barriers that I've seen that are kind of specific to the Muslim community is a lot of the stigma and shame that's associated. So, like as I said before, inherently there's a lot of shame that survivors feel when they experience such an occurrence. However, because of the way that the cultural context of how we approach sexuality and you know, sexual abuse, oftentimes the community has made it kind of immodest to openly talk about these issues, and so a lot of times survivors feel like they don't have a space that they can come forward and speak in a way that they won't be hushed or that they won't be blamed and silenced, and that results in them questioning their own part in the situation and doubting whether or not they could have actually prevented the crime from happening had they been quote unquote more modest or quote unquote more you know like, you know, separated from another gender and you know, and things like that. And so, you know, that leads to a lot of self-doubt. Did I make this happen? Did this even happen? I think this was in particular in the Chicago case, this was really a lot greater when you're talking about the perpetrator being a religious leader who has a high rapport and actually is seen to be someone with upstanding character. And when you have somebody who's supposed to be, you know, of really high moral character, it's almost hard. The survivor herself or himself will go into shock that he couldn't have done something like this because he's just such a, you know, great Muslim and great human being. So there's a lot of self-doubt. In particular, in this case, there's a lot of guilt of exposing the institution or an imam that is known to have done so much good in the community. And of course, a fear that no one would believe them, especially when the perpetrator has such an important role in the community. And one of the things that I also want to talk about, and then I'm going to hand it over to the other two, is the fear of social consequences. So when you're from a community that is so tight-knit and and word spreads really fast. The fear of, you know, dividing the community or dividing a family that is intimately involved in, you know, who's related to the perpetrator, or being socially ostracized, or being unmarriageable is a very real concern for a lot of survivors. And I think that that is something that we need to consider when we think about creating communities that are more supportive of survivors, because it is a very real concern what will happen to them socially.
Thank you so much for that, Nadia. Nabila, what are your thoughts about it?
I don't have too much to add because Nadia killed it right there. But something, yeah, right? Solidarity. But no, I completely agree with her in terms of this idea of families not, especially Muslim communities, not reporting. And I mean, I guess a small anecdote that I would have is in the work that I do, a lot of times I have Muslim women that come to me and, you know, I go through the list of what types of abuse they're experiencing. And when we get to the section of sexual abuse, it's extremely fuzzy for them because the conversation then goes into a different direction, and that direction is usually, well, I'm the wife and I'm expected to have sex with my husband. So even if I don't want it, it doesn't matter. In Islam, I'm told, I am mandated to have sex with my husband. And, you know, and it becomes extremely sad for me at that moment to kind of come to this realization of this is where the underreporting is happening, at least from my end. I mean, it's like, obviously it goes more beyond that, and Nadia hit it all too. But this just this idea, right? The stigma behind what is sex, especially when it's within a marriage, but also if we move into the realm of sex within a relationship, because we have to be very honest with ourselves. Muslim youth are having relationships, and a lot of stigma of that in and of itself. And then when we talk about sexual violence, people are so afraid to talk about it. And let's say if we start to move outside of a relationship, when it happens, for example, when I was raped last year, you know what? I'm going to be completely honest with you. My parents don't have a single clue, and I'm having this online panel, so who knows? They might find out this way. But there's the stigma for myself in terms of I don't want to shame my family, and this idea of shame, right? And it's extremely prevalent, not just in Muslim communities, but in many cultural communities, right? And my really good friend, Siobhan, also who happens to be my roommate, she mentioned something extremely, I thought it was extremely genius, right? Is that so many cultures are remixing patriarchy. And patriarchy and misogyny is so prominent, sexual violence, that we don't even understand how we are utilizing our very own language to kind of, I guess, in terms of barriers, right? Like, what are the barriers of sexual violence within our community? And it's the language of the patriarchy. It's how we as a community are remixing these ideals, remixing what it means to be modest, what it means to be pure, what it means to be innocent, and then merging it with sex and sexuality. And it becomes so problematic because where do victims go? And not all victims are female, mind you. How about the boys that are within also the, you know, the mosques that are being abused? They're not the idea of what sex looks like between a man and a woman. We aren't talking about sex within, you know, man and a man or a female and female. So also stigma behind the homosexual community, and we have to be very much aware that there are Muslims who identify as, you know, LGBTQIA, I believe is the last letter. So the queer community of the Muslims, right? So again, sex and sexuality, language, what are we addressing and how are we addressing it, and how prevalent is misogyny and the patriarchy within how we express, you know, what we say to survivors, what are we saying to victims? Those are some of the biggest things that come to mind in terms of what barriers are, in terms of, again, dialogue, the conversation. Like, when I'm talking to an imam, like, what is he saying that would make me feel safe. For example, in Sumaya's situation, talking about my experience, but also knowing that I'm not going to be shamed or rather being assaulted afterwards. You know, so things like that. But other than that, I'm gonna pass the mic over to our other phenomenal woman.
Samaya.
Well, that's been said already, and I'm probably going to revisit some points and repeat some points that have been said already. But speaking first from my own experience, I knew what happened. I knew that what happened to me when I was 12 was wrong, and I remembered that because I went to public school, and in first grade, we had an educator come in, and with puppets, she talked about good touch, bad touch. But after my assault, I told his mother, and she was the first one who blamed and shamed me. She told me this is what happens to girls like you, girls who are too playful. And so that planted a different seed in me. So I had the seed that said that no, what happened to me was wrong, and then another one that I was to blame. And this was someone who I had known since I was a very young child, and I adored her. So that left an impression on me that maybe there was something that I did that was wrong. And so at 12, you know, as a child, it's very hard to interpret all these mixed messages. And so I was left with thinking that maybe I did do something wrong, and I need to try and figure that out. And maybe I'm not even right with God. So there's a spiritual element that presents itself as a barrier as well, because one starts to question themselves, especially in a faith community. You know, what did I do wrong? Does God not love me anymore? Did I deserve this somehow? What is God trying to teach me? You know, who am I in the eyes of my family? Who am I amongst amongst my friends now? How will they perceive me if they ever find out? This is going to change everything. And so I went through a lot of self-doubt, and also I kept on telling myself that I needed to get over it, and that I didn't want to be broken, and I just told myself that I needed to be a tough girl. And I tried to tell myself that as much as possible to try and get over it, but that didn't do any good, because it's not something you can just get over. So I did my own minimizing game because nobody was telling me otherwise. Nobody wanted to talk to me about it. Nobody treated it like it was a terrible, awful incident that never should have happened. That's very traumatizing. And so I filled in all the blanks with all these also terrible messages of my own. And the problem is that it's not just within our Muslim community that we're not talking about this. Every single culture that we navigate through, you know, that we live within, from our schools, from media, from pop culture, from whatever, keeps on telling us different messages that are negative about who we are, especially as women, and about how we deserve to be treated. And that we deserve to be blamed and shamed, that we are responsible for these things, that, you know, it must be something about what we were wearing, or if we were flirting or not, our behavior, or we're just seeking attention. I've heard that a lot. Or that we're just liars, and that's just something that's inherent in our sex, and being women. We're less credible than our male counterparts. And so we receive all these messages from all these different arenas in our lives, and compound that together, and it's really difficult to break through that. And also, I mean, there's been times when we're talking about law enforcement, sometimes you have to be really vigilant because law enforcement doesn't always respond properly. And I remember there was a case that I was told about out here where a young girl was accompanied by someone who was a first responder to the police, and she was told by a female officer, "Do you really want to do this? You know, what do you think is going to happen to you in your community?" And so instead of being supportive, instead of standing by her and telling her that they will walk that walk with her, and that this is important, and, you know, whatever she wants to do, you know, they'll support her through, they undermined her being courageous. And yeah, that's a difficult walk to walk, having been traumatized. So there's a number of different barriers, and I'm glad that Navila brought up men as well, because men in large numbers are survivors as well. And the statistics are that 1 out of 6 men have experienced some kind of sexual abuse at some point in their lives. That's a lot. And we need to make sure that they are brought up in the conversation as well. I've met a number of Muslim male survivors, and the trauma and the stigma is immense, and we need to walk this walk together.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Yeah, I mean, definitely sexual violence in no way impacts women or girls or children only. It impacts everybody. I think that's a really important point that you mentioned. I also want to go back and talk a little bit more about particularly state responses to sexual violence, because for me, as someone who started out as a rape crisis counselor, really working around particularly right in the emergency room, trying to navigate the criminal justice system as well as just healthcare systems in general. For particularly women of color, there was this response of, yeah, it's not that serious, as Samia mentioned, the courageousness piece of how much resilience and courage it takes to even come forward. A lot of really preventing the survivor from even reporting, or just telling them that, oh, well, their sexual assault was not, quote unquote, as serious. And also in some cases, particularly with Muslim women, whether you are hijabi or not hijabi, there's this real negative stereotype, which I believe is connected to Islamophobia, which believes that women in our communities somehow accept being with Muslim means all violence is somehow normal or natural, and that we shouldn't be reporting domestic violence, we shouldn't be reporting anything because it's normal. And if we do report, a lot of times from law enforcement, including from, for example, recently I heard about a case in Canada where there was a young girl, multiple guys, and the guidance counselor never did anything about it because she was like, quote unquote, the community is going to respond to her in a negative way. So it's all these excuses that are being made by these systems, social services providers, or law enforcement. And I just want to put that out too, if any of you want to particularly dig a little bit deeper about, Samia mentioned that a little bit, but particularly around even social services providers, mainstream victim services agencies like rape crisis counselors, who tend to believe that they know our community, our religion, our culture better than we do. And hence we shouldn't even be coming forward about that. Anybody want to go with that?
I just wanted to add one more thing. I brought it up minutely, just about how survivors are commonly shamed. And when we talk about, specifically within the Muslim community, we talk about clothing, especially. And I've had a number of people tell me that they were told that, oh, it's because you took off hijab, it's because you strayed from your deen that this happened to you. And the thing is that even though the way one dresses, if one chooses to wear hijab, niqab, jilbab, whatnot, and expresses their values through that, and it's, and it should be respected, the thing is that doesn't mean it's protection. Because what we know is that there are hijabis who have been assaulted, niqabis who have been assaulted, women wearing jilbab who were assaulted. These things aren't protections from being assaulted. And I think that's one of the most common misconceptions about sexual violence that leads to victim blaming and shaming. And the real culprit here, and the real issue, is the perpetrator. If there's the presence of a perpetrator, then no one's safe. Doesn't matter what you're wearing. And then the other aspect to this is, and we're talking about misconceptions within our community, is that the idea of gender segregation. And again, Navila brought this up, that it could be male-on-male violence. There have been boys who have been raped by their Quran teachers or molested by an uncle or a neighbor, or females who were sexually coerced by a youth group leader who is female. Like there are all these incidents which speak to that we have to rethink and readdress how we think sexual violence happens, and the victim blaming and shaming that happens because of the misconceptions we've chosen to carry and not question.
Samaya. Thank you, Samaya, for mentioning that. And I want to get into particularly, I love that you mentioned the piece around hijab. And so specifically, I feel like that's part of our rape culture within Muslim communities, is the ways in which modesty and hijab is used. This idea that if you're not a hijabi, if you're not a perfect, modest woman, then you must have asked for it. And so I wonder if we can get a little bit deeper into particularly how rape culture manifests itself within our local Muslim communities, and how sometimes religion is exploited to further that. And so if we could talk about that a little bit, be great. So go to Nadia. I think your microphone is mute.
Yeah. Okay. So I was just vigorously shaking my head to everything Samaya said, because she was totally right on target. One of the things that's important to think about is exactly that. You know, a lot of times our community focuses on, you know, hijab and gender segregation and not dating, and you know, some of these things that, you know, a lot of the auntie and uncle generation tend to say it's to protect you and it's to, you know, keep you from getting assaulted. But for me, I think what working with survivors for the last 5 years has taught me, and in particular with this case in particular, is that we really need to start rethinking the way that we talk about these issues openly. And I'm talking at every level. I'm talking at the dinner table with your family, to at the school, at your Sunday school, to the imams, you know, at the mosque level. And until we start having these open conversations, a lot of and challenging some of these ideas that Samaya brought up about, you know, does hijab really protect you? Does, you know, not dating protect you? We really won't be getting anywhere in terms of you know, debunking some of these myths. And I think it's, you know, in terms of, you know, this situation in particular, I mean, this was a very strict conservative, you know, Quran school. So all of those things were in place. There was a strict you know, dress code where all the women had to wear niqab. There was a strict gender segregation. But like Sumaya said, when there's a perpetrator in the room, they're going to find ways. And that's really what we need to talk about, is how do we stop the perpetrator and not focus on these arbitrary things like hijab or gender segregation, or telling our children that they can't go on dates because this is going to happen to them. And you know, granted, I don't want to dismiss, you know, any of these faith values that our faith, you know, upholds and respects. But I think that, you know, we need to see it in a balance and sort of examine how can we start having these discussions where we hold the crime and the perpetrator accountable, and not keep pushing the blame back to the victim that, you know, he or she did something to bring this upon them.
Mm-hmm. What do you think about that in terms of rape culture? And also, some of the questions we're getting is that the struggle of explaining rape culture within Muslim communities. So, for example, like Muslim Girl, when the entire sort of thing was launched, like one of the first articles we wrote was The Hypocrisy of the Male-Centric Narrative, and it talked about rape culture, and we had like 90 comments from men being like, shut up, this is just a bunch of feminists wanting to, you know, they don't understand, it's your fault. And so it's very frustrating to have these conversations in general across the board, but also in Muslim communities. I find it's really tough because very quickly there's this idea of, oh, you feminists, this is some Western stuff, don't come and talk to us about about it. So how do you also deal with that frustration while from a loving place saying, I love my community and I care and I want us to address this problem, which is structural, but then you get all this backlash, and a lot of time it comes from men, but also women as well. But it's very frustrating, especially being a survivor. It can be very triggering as well. So some recommendations around that would be great.
That a lot.
Oh, go ahead, Nabila. Go ahead, Nabila.
That a lot and often. Sorry, I'm sorry. With this thing, I'm like being kicked off, so I apologize if I like ever repeat or if I'm like intruding.
No.
Apparently, right?
Not at all.
But one of the things in these conversations, and I'm gonna say men for this moment, but I also want to say Muslim men, is extremely frustrating, but I have to do it with a smile on my face because it can be aggressive very quickly, and that's just because of the language being used. And something that I'm not sure if anyone mentioned this, but is the idea of using scripture, right? The idea of using scripture to kind of validify the fact that feminism is not real. Sexual violence is not something that is that big of an issue, and it's because of, for example, the whole idea of what are women to be hijabi. I took off hijab, and one of the comments I received after I revealed that I was raped to maybe a few people, was that had I been wearing hijab, you know, I would not have been raped. But the reality is I was so sexually harassed on the streets of Philly when I was a hijabi. So, I mean, if we're going to talk about what we're wearing, I think it's very minimal to the bigger conversation of, well, why aren't we addressing the fact that there is no equality in terms of how we look at each other as human beings? And that's end up being with, you know, these Muslim men, is trying to treat them as a human being and allowing them to see that humanness in me and breaking things down as simply as possible, because I think that's the only way to do it, right? And even if it means for me to be repetitive, even if it means for me to identify and say, well, listen, you can't blame the victim over and over again, because that's usually the rhetoric that's being used in the various ways that a lot of these individuals do it, is blaming the victim, not necessarily directly, but also through scripture, through hadith, through, like, you know, like the different Quranic verses, and just as using Islam as a whole of saying, well, we need to, you know, create modesty amongst ourselves in a community, and it's a threat if women do X, Y, Z, you know, without, and then to follow up and say, but I understand that sexual violence is a problem, and I don't advocate, you know, against it. I'm for, you know, advocating and supporting women and survivors and victims. So it's almost, you know, them trying to cover themselves, and it's unfortunate because you can see how the rhetoric just does not match, and it's frustrating. I have a better way of doing it, but I mean, those are some of my own anecdotes. Is that there's always a sense of blaming the victim, and it's so frustrating because it's extremely triggering, back to some very, very dark places in my life, and to have to be, you know, at the vanguard of, you know, addressing sexual violence, but then also at the vanguard of being a victim, because I don't maybe necessarily identify as a survivor just yet. So these conversations and, like, you know, having it with the Muslim community can become a very emotional thing, because sometimes there are moments where I just don't want to engage, because it is emotional, and it's unfair that we have to explain ourselves, and that's the biggest thing is that victims and survivors are always explaining ourselves, and it's kind of like, well, where's the community to help back us up and to say, hey, we're here for you, and you don't have to explain because you are being traumatized, and we don't want to put you through that re-traumatization, you know? So that's a little bit for me.
No, that's great. Thank you so much for that. Samia?
Yeah. especially in the beginning when I first started sharing my story, it was very difficult. And I think that was largely because I hadn't really undergone the healing process for myself, and I wasn't able to own my own story quite yet. But the more I got comfortable with my story, and the more I was able to own my story so it didn't have control over me, the less I could be intimidated. And the less triggered I would find myself. I still struggle, and I'm still triggered. And I'm still in the healing process. But the more I find myself having faith in my story and my experience, that's helped me. And I mentioned faith, and that's been a very important part of my life. And one of the verses that gave me a lot of strength throughout my life was the verse from Surah An-Nisa, verse 135. O you who believe, stand firmly as witnesses, stand firmly for justice as witnesses for God, even if it be against your parents, your relatives, against your tribe, even if the case is of a rich person or a poor person. So that's unshakable for me. My faith tells me that I need to speak out for justice. Because I'm not just doing it for myself, I'm doing it for many other people. And the more that I speak out, inshallah, there may be many other people who will speak out as well. And the thing is that there are going to be a lot of people who are naysayers. But there's also a lot of low-hanging fruit out there. There's a lot of people who want to be able to protect their families, who have people who are in their families who are survivors, male or female, and who want direction, who want to know how to seek support for the members of their families or their friends, or for themselves. And that's what I found as I've been talking about this, that there's a lot of people who are interested in learning more about this and learning what can be done. And so that helps me silence the people who are who attack us so viciously on this topic. And I feel that if I have enough compassion to know that this is a process of educating people, then that encourages me not to act as viciously as they do, and just have a lot more compassion in my message. And in time, inshallah, they'll learn, and they'll listen. And they'll learn that they play an important part in keeping their community safe. And that may mean for themselves or for people that they love. So I have hope in that. And also, it's draining to be angry all the time. It really, really is. So I remind myself to have patience and have calm and have faith. And I always remember that there are a lot of people who have supported me, and many more people who have supported me than not on my journey. And there's a lot of other people out there who I don't know who stand with me, and that I continue to meet as well. So that helps me keep my cool.
Oh my God.
I wanted to add one thing. I'm so sorry. Sumaya, thank you
definitely.
So much. Thank you so much for your input, because that, I mean, I think just the conversation in itself is like a healing space as well, almost like a mini therapy session. But you're absolutely right in trying to remind ourselves of the number of supporters we do have. And something that my therapist told me actually yesterday, which I found to be empowering, was the fact that I, as an individual, make the decision to not let my perpetrator affect me moving forward in my healing process. And that's something that I have to kind of embody within myself at some point, because I'm not there yet. But in terms of for those that are out there that are victims or survivors, I think that's a very, very important thing to remember, is that you make that decision. Just like our community makes the decision to support us or not, we make the decision for ourselves as individuals, as victims, as survivors, to move forward and say, this is not going to affect me because I am more than that. I transcend, you know, this this heinous crime that has happened against me. You know, I transcend all this nonsense, and I transcend any type of anger that I have for that person, but rather I'm going to move forward with the faith that I have in God, but also the faith that I have within myself, because again, I make that decision. And again, thank you so much, Sumaya, for putting it so beautifully in terms of, yes, you know, like, there are people that don't support us, but there are so many more others that are there for us, and, you know, to be able to acknowledge that is extremely important, because again, that helps with the healing process, especially, you know, in a community within the Muslim community that might not necessarily be there for a lot of individuals.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Again, thank you to both of you. That was incredibly powerful. You know, it's interesting because even for me, when I think about, well, where does the passion for this work, is it anger or is it love? And I always say it's love for my community, it's love for my local Muslim community, love for my family, because at the end of the day, it harms us so much, because if in your intimate relationships, if we cannot trust people, how exactly are we supposed to fight in this movement against state structural violence or oppression that's happening against our communities if we can't even trust each other? So again, it comes from, I love that Samia mentioned, that's love of justice, in particular that our faith tells us to stand up for justice no matter who it is. And I've always felt that Islam provides us with the most beautiful and encompassing definition of what justice means. And so with that, I want to talk, and I want to ask all of us, like, what does justice for survivors look like? And what does accountability look like? What would transformative change look like? One of the things I'm always constantly talking in the work that I do with local projects doing this work is that we can't always use the carceral state, and while I understand the importance of having criminal justice options, is that necessarily the solution that we want, or how do we do prevention? How do we transform our communities? And so I want to ask this question to all of you around, what does justice look like for survivors, and accountability on top of that for perpetrators?
I have something to say about this. So I definitely believe that justice is necessary, even within the criminal justice system. For those survivors who are willing to speak out and use the system, I think that's important. But justice is also breaking the silence within our communities and talking about this, so that we create safer communities. The more we talk about this, the less our communities become safe havens for perpetrators. And the more our communities become safe havens for survivors to come forward and to heal, along with their families and their loved ones. So the more that we do this, the more we push out the perpetrators, and we create this safe zone within our communities. And for me, that's part of justice. That's our community saying that this was wrong, that this is unacceptable, that we will not condone anything like this. And that's very healing for a survivor, and for the secondary victims within the community. And I believe that justice is also a big part of justice is compassion, and vice versa. You can't have one without the other. There is no justice without compassion, and there is no compassion without justice. And I think that compassion first starts with self. If you don't have compassion for yourself, then you're working with a very limited amount of compassion to offer other people. And I see this also with a lot of survivors, that there's a lot of shaming and blaming that happens amongst each other as well, and a lot of other people who have experienced different kinds of traumas in their lives, where if you weren't told that whatever happened to you, whether it was sexual assault or whether it was a different kind of trauma, if you weren't told and if you weren't supported through that and told that was tragic, and that and had other people to walk with you, then it's difficult for you to learn compassion for yourself and to offer compassion to other people as well. And it's easier to give other people the message that they should just get over it. But having compassion as it relates to justice is key. And the more that we show compassion to our survivors by listening to their stories, and by taking to heart their stories, then we can understand what we need to do to prevent and respond to these acts, these transgressions.
Mm-hmm.
I tend to ramble, but I hope that was
No, that was perfect. Please, Samaya, you're amazing. Stop it.
So I have a lot to say on that as well. So just when we were working on this recent case, one of the things that I found frustrating was for the community, like the silence around the community response. And so a lot of what we heard was kind of like this really big discomfort around this topic, around this issue, and kind of like a let's just let law enforcement do their job. Because this is really not our problem. Let's just let law enforcement do their job. And I think that can be really incredibly frustrating for a number of reasons. First, as I mentioned, there's a very high rate of underreporting in communities of color. And so, we are seeing the strong likelihood that a survivor just may not want to go to the police. Then we're also looking at the possibility that some can't go to the police, even if they want to, either because of community and family pressure, or simply because the time between their abuse and when they actually want to disclose is so much that their statute of limitations has run out. And then the third point that I want to talk about is just the fact that law enforcement, going to law enforcement, I agree, Sumaya, especially, like, it's great. And it's a great way to see justice, especially if the perpetrator is found guilty or is arrested. But it's also very traumatizing and re-traumatizing and draining, and a really long process for survivors. And so that's another reason that perhaps they may not want to follow through with the process or continue. But seeking justice looks different for, some of our survivors. It was enough for them to just come forward to us and say, you know what, this happened to us. We just want you to know that this girl's story is legit. And that was enough for them. Some of them wanted to be able to tell their stories in a more public way by talking to the media, and that was justice. Some of them were actually looking for religious leaders to actually speak out against it and stand up. And that sort of institutional support, I think, is crucial, when we're talking about community accountability. And then the other thing to consider is, especially when survivors file as Jane Does, they can't reveal their identities. They don't want to reveal their identity, but they are very closely watching how the community responds. And I think that it's a missed opportunity for the general community to just be like, let law enforcement do their job. We're really not. We don't have a say. And what does that look like for community accountability when you know that there's a perpetrator there? Perhaps he or she has not been found guilty yet. The case might take many, many years, but what does that mean until in between that time in terms of their leadership position? And how, whether or not they're giving chutzpahs, or whether or not they're speaking at speaking engagements, or working with children, or whoever was their main audience. And so I think that these are just questions that we've been grappling with as a group, and trying to kind of create some conversation around.
And it's not like these perpetrators perpetrate only once. It tends to be that they perpetrate multiple times. And so we can't just slap them on the hand and say, you shouldn't do that. That was bad. You need to correct your ways. We need to address it sternly and find out from the community if anyone else has been affected by this person as well. Because it tends to be that there are multiple survivors with every case. And so when we keep these things secret and we try to handle it with silence, we allow for the perpetrator to keep perpetrating. Mm-hmm. And even for myself, the incident from when I was younger, I found out only in my late 20s that I wasn't the only one. And then it took me 5 more years after the incident with my mom to find out that there really was many more. There were many more women who were affected by this person as well.
I think that's an excellent point to bring up, right? Is the idea that you know, when we stay silent, what ends up happening is we find out later on that other people have been victims to that same person, and that's extremely horrifying, one, but also very sad on, you know, like the part on the people that stay silent. And again, how does that look like in terms of justice for survivors? I think one of the things is for the leaderships, right, like the leadership of the community, to start elevating the stories of the survivors and victims, right? And to kind of start using this language and to also have the tools to understand what it means to be at the front line of the first person to receive information of someone who decides to reveal their sexual assault or violence, right? Because whatever that victim or survivor hears is the one thing that sticks with them for the rest of their healing or non-healing process. And I think it's very important for the community to engage and to be taught, and for there to be trainings, especially within the Muslim community, in terms of language. What is the language that we're using with survivors and victims? What does trauma look like? And what is the language that we use so that individuals are not re-traumatized, and that we are telling them that, hey, we believe you and we're here for you, because law enforcement might not necessarily be there. Just a small anecdote of myself is when I went to law enforcement, and I'm so happy, Nadia, that you brought up statute of limitations. And I mean, it varies from state to state, and I'm in New York. So for me, I went within 6 months, because I just didn't want to report at the time that it happened because of, again, stigma. So for me, my statute did not run out. However, law enforcement and the detectives I was working with, they blamed me. And I mean, what's the product of that? The product of that is me having a complete distrust of the criminal justice system, and even trying to work with them and trying to address it, right? Because the language that they used wasn't "I believe you," but rather "we don't believe you because maybe you actually did want this," right? So I think as a community, especially a Muslim community, being able to engage with them and say, hey, we need to watch what we say, especially if the person is coming to you and you are the first person. We really need to be aware of what we say. Sometimes we don't have to say anything, and we can just say, like, I'll hold your hand, you can cry, you can not cry, but I believe you, because that's one of the first steps of justice for victims, right? Is to have that notion of there is belief in our assault, in what happened to us, and that we can move forward because people are willing to walk with us in that journey. And by us, or by people, I mean the community, right? Especially the Muslim community, who's, it's unfortunate, but sometimes are just so hesitant when it comes to things that deal with sex and sexuality, right? Also, another thing is just like understanding the nuances of trauma, and also the nuances of stories of victims and survivors. Not all of them look alike, and we cannot be dismissive to any one of those stories. They are all one and part parcel of a package of what we call sexual violence, and that's something that we're trying to break apart. And I think it's important, again, that we use our language as one of the leading factors towards justice, but also working with the criminal justice system, understanding what it means to give trainings, what it means to be the first person to hear, what it means to kind of embody a sense of compassion and empathy for victims and survivors, and also to hold the perpetrator accountable, because we rarely do that. We want to move away from that. We don't want to have conversations about what accountability looks like and what a perpetrator looks like, because they can look like anything. They could be anyone. They're not only subject to men, women can also be perpetrators too. And so for us to acknowledge that as a community, I think it's easier to say this is what we need to do. There's a dichotomy, right? And we need to be the best way to move forward and be more effective, because we can't just work on prevention, because prevention sometimes unfortunately looks like, well, don't dress like that and don't say this and then you'll be okay. But when it comes to perpetrators, we're not saying, hey, don't commit the crime. Well, how do we define the crime itself, right? So I think those are some things. Justice for victims is accountability of perpetrators, but also conversations of what it means to be a perpetrator and how do we end that? How do we end sexual violence from happening? And also, just to kind of focus on, instead of just only prevention. I believe in prevention, but we shouldn't just only talk about prevention. That sometimes does a disservice, especially within communities that don't even understand the definition of sexual violence.
Mm-hmm. Great.
And I wanted to add that it's not possible to prevent, unfortunately, every single case. Bad things will happen. Bad things happen all the time. But what we know from research is that when you nip trauma in the bud and you're able to respond to it properly, as Avila is suggesting, then you can help that person start to heal much earlier on instead of having to carry the trauma with them throughout their life. And when that happens, it becomes a different kind of monster in the life of the survivor. And I think it's really important that we understand what trauma looks like for survivors. And as Nabila said that it's different for every survivor, but it's important for our communities to understand what that looks like so we can understand and develop our compassion, our empathy, and move towards seeking justice, because it really is tragic. I mean, when we learn what post-traumatic stress disorder is, these are the symptoms these are the things that survivors of sexual assault go through. It's chronic depression, chronic anxiety, eating disorders, self-harm. Even the emotional stress takes a toll on the physical body. So not only are you experiencing these emotional and mental struggles, but one can also be experiencing digestive issues, chronic migraines, back pains, asthma. There's so many different physical illnesses that come from the stress of carrying the weight of trauma. And then on top of it, self-harm and suicidal ideations, this is, within this population, it's through the roof. Mm-hmm. And even more so, suicide is through the roof within the population of survivors. And so if you're the first responder to someone who's coming forward, so to someone who has the courage to come forward and tell you in their time of need that this has happened to them, understand that you could be potentially that person who makes it or breaks it in terms of whether their suicidal ideations will run wild and will lead them to self-harm. And I've heard multiple cases of this, not just outside of our community, within our community. Mm-hmm. And a lot of these cases go untalked about, and it said, oh, it was an accident, and or there's silence around the suicide, but it's happening, and we shouldn't neglect that our response could be what harms that person, and it is often the case that the aftermath is just as traumatizing, if not worse, than the assault itself.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you so much, Samia, for sharing that. I also just want to go back to particularly, we talked about the rates of sexual violence. They say every 2 minutes someone is sexually assaulted in this country. So in terms of high, also going back, our criminal justice system right now, major improvements need to be made across the board regarding survivors. When I first started out being an advocate, one of my biggest goals was to get to that emergency room before a cop showed up, because I knew I had to prepare the survivor for the interrogation that the survivor was about to go through. A lot of times law enforcement come into those rooms and they think about really trying to tease apart or rip apart a survivor's story, not understanding how trauma works, not understanding how neurotrauma works. So, for example, a lot of times the way a survivor might be responding is it's really hard because it's so traumatic to be giving the particular of that case. And so to talk talk about it is to relive that experience constantly, which is why when survivors talk, we must appreciate that they're actually reliving that once again. The other thing around particularly prosecution rates, so at any given point, only 3% of all perpetrators ever get to be convicted in our criminal justice system. And from that, 90% of those actually end up back into the community in 1 year. So we need to be thinking about, wait, we need to improve our criminal justice responses, but at the same time, at this point, a lot of times people think, you know, the idea of the false allegation that someone is, you know, falsely accusing someone at the criminal justice system is going to get this guy. But in reality, the overwhelming number of survivors never ever get to see any justice from the criminal justice system. That's one thing. The process is also very, very long. So when I went into my sort of policy research side and was going across the country meeting prosecutors focused on this, one prosecutor said something to me that really stuck with me forever. She said, when she tells a survivor, do you want to press charges, she says, are you ready to deal with him walking out of this criminal justice system scot-free because, quote unquote, we couldn't prove a 90%, or we couldn't, with the evidence, we couldn't show that this happened. And so a lot of times survivors are re-victimized by the criminal justice system, finding it incredibly invasive, incredibly completely ripping apart the legitimate, the quote unquote credibility of a survivor. And so it's a very violent process, and some survivors then, you know, recant. They completely take their case out of the criminal justice system, not because it didn't happen, but because it's such a traumatizing process. And so often our community members tend to think that recants are actually that someone lied, and it's not that. It's just, it's such a very, very traumatizing experience. The other thing I want to talk about is the criminalization of survivors that has happened. In the DC area, for example, we had an 11-year-old girl who was a survivor of sexual assault. She was not, when she went to report, she was arrested and actually charged with false reporting, which has been happening. So it's not just that the criminal justice system is not working, it's also turning around and criminalizing survivors at the same time in the name of quote-unquote false allegations. So those are just some things I wanted to put out there, and also transition into the piece around institutional responses. So one of the questions we're getting is regarding, for example, like how should masjids respond? How should community centers respond? I know that all of you are doing work to also build up institutional responses in our community, so it'd be wonderful if some of you could talk about that. I'll just go with Nadia first, or whoever else wants to start.
Well, number one, it is important that our institutions have policies and procedures in place, and that understanding is made clear within whether it's our mosque or community centers or educational institutions, so that when something happens, they know immediately how to respond to that event. And they know that, okay, by law, I'm supposed to do X, Y, and Z. This is what we need to do for the survivors when they come forward, and this is what we say, this is what we don't say. You know, this is how we walk with the family, and this is how we talk to the community about these things. And that means that we also need to have trainings within our institutions, and starting with sexual harassment trainings. Where I work at USC, it's mandatory that we go through a yearly sexual harassment training. Every single employee of the university has to do this. And that says a number of things. That says, one, is that this issue is so prevalent that it requires everybody to go through this annually. And number two, the liability is so high that this, you know, it needs to be addressed. And I think our institutions, you know, when they fail to understand that, you know, this is re-traumatizing, if they don't respond properly, it traumatizes the survivors, and it can lead to more victimization, then, you know, then you have to explain that, well, you know, your institution can be held liable by law and will suffer financially as well, and will lose face in the eyes of the broader community when it's not handled properly. But yeah, like education on all levels. You know, with the Catholic Church, what they instituted, and I love to take a lot of my learnings from the Catholic Church, since they had to make changes. Every single administrator and every single volunteer within the Catholic Church has to be fingerprinted and has to go through a training. And then every student within their educational institutions has to undergo has to go through a class where they're taught good touch, bad touch. And so there's different, there's different classes that are age appropriate for each level. And so this ensures that they've created a space where it's talked about and that lets perpetrators know that they will not be protected by the Catholic Church and that survivors will be supported. And so that's how we build safe spaces for our communities to thrive in. And those are the learnings that we can take and implement within our own institutions. And I strongly believe in this, that this will make a dramatic change. And it's little by little, but this will definitely make an impact.
Great, awesome. Nadia, do you want to chime in?
I don't really have much to add to that. I think Samaya did a great job. I want to echo her her points on working with interfaith communities, faith communities that have been through this process and kind of learn from their lessons learned. That's one of the things that we did early on when we were dealing with this case. Is we met with a number of faith leaders in the Christian community, in Jewish community, and kind of just get their thoughts on how they worked on exposing such an issue and such a sensitive topic in the community. And so I think that it's really important to think about these kinds of partnerships. They can be very valuable.
And I've heard pushback from some institutions saying that this is an inappropriate conversation to be had within their walls and within their communities. But at the end of the day, our communities should be healing spaces and they should be supportive spaces. They're not just for social occasions, and for laughing and for having parties together. That's all wonderful and that's great. But we live within communities for a reason. We need that support from our communities. That's how we stay healthy, and that's how we thrive. And that's how we create resiliency within from within the individual to the family to the community. And I've also heard some say that this distracts from the larger issues that the Muslim community faces. But if we're suffering internally from these kinds of traumas and from the other kinds of traumas that are affecting us as well, and we don't address them, if we don't address this, if we don't address discrimination, if we don't address bullying, if we don't address the issues that are harming us with our civil liberties, then we cannot be strong enough to address any of those issues. And even the many challenges that are going to surely lie ahead of us if we don't start creating the strength and resiliency and the ability to address the uncomfortable within our communities.
Nabila, do you want to say something?
I feel like everyone things that needed to be said, but yeah, I mean trainings, but also through trainings of the community, but also kind of getting the community to start speaking out and enforcing policy, right? Like policy change needs to happen. Like we do the trainings with our communities, support, but if we want the criminal justice system to be on our considering policy and what that means to us as a community as well, what are some of the things that are being problematic time and time again in terms of sexual violence, and what are things that we need to address in terms of laws, and how do we implement that through the voices of community members? And I think that's something also that we need, that can be done too, in terms of like what are we doing institutionally in terms of our voices, because our voices matter in so many ways, and being able to push for policy change can be a life-changing matter for anyone that's trying to convict, right? Because we've discussed so far, within the past 2 hours almost, is the idea that law enforcement isn't necessarily always there for you. So how do we make them there for us? And how do we make it so that the criminal justice system is on our side? And policy change and policy enforcement is definitely one of those issues that needs to be touched upon. And it happens through the voices of the community, not just the individuals and, you know, attorneys and people that are already within the realms of politics, but also comedians who matter because it affects us at the end of the day.
Cool. Anybody else want to say anything? I'll just add to that piece around policy, is that policy is really important work, but at the same time we also need structural changes. And so a lot of times, particularly with sexual violence, like there are ways that race, gender, class, access, all of that plays out to who ends up being at the margins of the margins and what are the consequences in terms of social support. So I think the challenge I always face in the policy realm is how do we make sure that policies are actually melding up to something that's structural wide change. Otherwise, you can pass policies and what you see in implementation looks so different. Sometimes that policy can be harmful. So for example, right now, one of the things that's happening is opening untested kits, sexual assault forensic medical exam kits that were never ever examined for evidence. And yet there are some survivors who are getting triggered again or after years and years of trying to heal from the process. So again, policy is very messy, implementation is really messy, and so we also have to think about structural stuff. With that, I think we're kind of coming to a close. I want to give every single panelist a chance to do concluding remarks and also how to get involved with the work that you're doing. All of you have your group organizations and different localities across the country you're doing. If people want to get involved, what can they do? And how to continue this work onwards. So I'll start with whoever wants to go first.
I guess I'll go. Mine is going to be super quick. Julie and I are still working on the cathartist, so if anything, you can always contact us at our email, which is cathartist.the@gmail.com. You can also visit our website, which is www.thecathartist, and I can spell it out, HARTIST.com. We're also on Facebook and Twitter, so there are various ways that you can engage with us. We do a lot of work in terms of trying to speak at several events, so if you ever want us to speak or do trainings, we're more than happy to do so. Julie's centered in North Carolina, I'm centered in New York. We also have our sister website project called Words Over Violence, www.wordsoverviolence.tumblr.com, and you can submit your photos in terms of why you stand up against sexual violence within the community in terms of one of our advocacy projects. So those are some things that we're doing. We're also working on some short YouTube 5-minute documentaries. So for those of you that are interested, that identify as a survivor or identify as an advocate and would like to be videotaped, please email us or contact me through Twitter. We can set that up and get you videotaped just to talk about certain things that are going on in terms of sexual violence within our communities. So those are some activities and things that we're doing and ways that you all can be involved through photographs and through our website. And also just for anyone that needs a space of healing, please feel free to come and talk to us through our email or even submit your work online to us.
Yay!
Well, mine will be very quick because we are not as developed as Nabila's organization or as Heart, Nadia's organization. But we just bought our domain name, rahmanetwork.com. So look out for it. Rahma spelled R-A-H-M-A network.com. And what we'll be putting on there are resources for communities, for families, for communities, to learn how to address and prevent sexual violence and abuse. In the meantime, you're also welcome to friend me on Facebook. Mm-hmm. And I definitely welcome messages, emails, communication about any of this. We do, my partner and I from the Catholic Church, we do workshops for faith communities on how to address and respond to sexual violence. So let me know, and we'd be happy to hopefully put something together for you. Yes, that is it for now.
So if you want to contact me, you can email me. My email address is nadia@heartwomenandgirls.org. That's NADIAH at heartwomenandgirls.org. Our website is www.heartwomenandgirls.org. We are on Facebook and Twitter as well. You know, I would love to do trainings and speaking engagements. I also have educators actually across the country and in Canada. So, you know, if there's somebody in California, we have several in California, we have several in Canada, and then Chicago. We're always looking for more educators. So if you're interested in joining that kind of work, if you're interested in guest blogging for us, or even regular, consistently blogging for us, that would be great. We do a lot of writing and a lot of like toolkit development and dissemination. So if there's a toolkit or publication that you're interested in working on, that would be something. And then also we are also interested in a lot of research that's specific to faith-based communities. In fact, Dharaksha and I are working on a small pilot project on sexual violence in the Chicago community. So if that's something that you want to be involved in, you know, there's a number of things that you can do. And of course, please like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter.
I'll take volunteers too. I need to help with the effort. And I also just want to say one more thing. For those of you that are really interested in learning more about what to do, I highly recommend starting out with your local rape crisis center. They do trainings for individuals, and they will provide you with a lot of information and resources to be able to start being a resource for your own community and your own friends. And that's how you can start becoming, just joining the response and advocacy on this issue.
Sure. Anybody else want to chime in before I want to say ways that people get as well? Does anyone want to say any other last words?
Thank you so much, Muslim Girl Net, for having all of us. This was a phenomenal panel. I want to thank Nadia and Sumaya for their wonderful insight and stories, and just you all phenomenal. And I completely am honored to be on this panel and just really happy that we were able to have this conversation. So thank you all so much. Thank you, Muslim Girl Net. Thank you to all the viewers who are listening, who are contributing, and who are asking a lot of important questions. So I'm like really happy about that. So thank you all.
Thank you. No, I really echo everything Nabila said, and I'm so honored to be in all of your guys' company. Thank you so much.
Ditto. And just a quick message to the survivors that are out there, that healing is possible. It's a long and hard walk, but it is possible, and there's beauty on the other side of it. And you have a lot of prayers coming from in a lot of different angles for you to along that process.
Thank you so much for saying that. I'll just say that I'm Dharaksha, and I'm in the local DC area. I'm part of the local DC Justice Survivors Campaign, and we are really working in the city to monitor the local sexual assault law that was recently passed. We have an entire survivors sort of working group, and so if any of you are around here in the DC metro area, please contact me. I'm on Facebook as well as Twitter. I would love to have more Muslims with me involved. I'm one of the only ones, and too often when it comes to these important city council hearings or the policy recommendations, our community just completely gets left out because we're not always at the table. So I'd love if people want to join me in that. I'm also working with Heart on a research project. If you want to help me out with that, that'd be great. And if you want to be involved and write, please write to Muslim Girl. Muslim Girl has been incredible, providing this wonderful platform that frankly many other Muslim organizations and Muslim outlets have not been providing, and has done it. And so I want to thank Amani, who's not here, who really kind of let me organize this and let me, you know, use this Muslim Girl platform to do it. So big shout out to her and Muslim Girl. Definitely submit your articles to them. They're great. They're a great voice for us. And I just want to echo that thank you to all of you. You all inspire me. It was so healing to, as a survivor, to listen to so many of you and just know that we're also on the front lines doing the work. I really detest stress when people talk about us as they have to save us, or that we're just something in the foreign, but that we're not really human and that we're not just people. And so I really love that. And thank you to all the viewers and panelists. I've been looking at your feedback on Twitter. I really appreciate it. We're going to do another Twitter chat actually near Crime Victims' Rights Week, so around April 19th or so. We'll have another one that's going to be a little bit broader and talk about what does it mean as Muslim women, what does safety mean for us, and we'll talk sexual assault and also other forms. So with that, I'm just going to say have a great night. Get in touch with us. If you're a survivor, you're not alone. Reach out to us if you want. So again, thank you, beautiful ladies. Good night.
Good night.
Good night.